Hello and welcome to episode number 247 of the Armin Show podcast. This is the place to be. We are here with author of this book right here, Friendship, Lydia Denworth. The book is The Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. Lydia, glad to have you on the show.
It's great to be here.
This is a wonderful thing. Now, let me do an introduction of sorts, which I'm starting to do. It's entertaining to do in some ways too. But you are a science journalist. You're author of this book. You have been a science journalist for a long time. You have written other books as well, popular science books. I Can Hear You Whisper, An Intimate Journey Through the Science of Sound and Language, and Toxic Truth, A Scientist, a Doctor, and The Battle Over Lead. You've contributed to Scientific American, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Time, and these are all the biggest publications that we know of, frankly. I don't know if there's any bigger ones. That's a wonderful thing. How did you get into science journalism at first?
That's actually an interesting story because I was a journalist, but I had zero interest in science. I was the kid who took the least amount of science in high school and college possible.
Mm-hmm.
But I have always been a writer and always a journalist. And in an early job, I was on staff at Newsweek early on as a reporter and fact checker. And I worked with the science writer. I got assigned to help her on some stories. And I would say, I'm really not the person you want. And she said, yeah. All you have to be is smart enough to ask questions and just keep asking questions. And basically, to be a good science writer, you have to be willing to admit ignorance every single day and admit what you don't know. But so there was that moment early on where I had this thought that, okay, maybe just because I don't have a background in science doesn't mean I can't do it. But it wasn't until I did my first book, which was Toxic Truth, the lead book that you just mentioned. And I got interested in it from a kind of health perspective, from children's health perspective. But then I ended up writing about these two researchers. One was a doctor who looked at kids, but the other was a geochemist at Caltech. And I had to get into some really intense science. And I found that it was really fascinating, and also that I turned out to be better than I expected at describing it to people and about telling the story. And that was basically all she wrote. That was 15 years ago, and I have been writing about science ever since.
Oh, this is a cool thing. I've noticed, this is a nice feature that I don't usually get to comment, but a lot of my books that I've read and interviewed about were from scientists, which are really my folks. And I haven't really enjoyed that many books from science journalists. Your book has changed the tone here because it's not that easy. I don't know if people realize this, but to bring a level of information like a scientist without doing all the specific science is not light. So a few times I started to realize like I'm not really into works from science journalists, but that's not the case in this case. So
well, I feel honored. I feel really honored.
I have to share these things. I noticed these things.
Yes.
Somebody
all right.
must voice
Thank
these
you.
things. Yes. Now, one other cool feature I noticed as I'm reading through the book, a few of the scientists you mentioned I've interviewed, and also you get to meet so many different ones along the way. That's one of my favorite features about what you're doing. I like that actually more than specifically one field. I like the connectivity. Do you like that concept?
I do. And I feel in my book like the scientists, though. I treat them a little bit like characters in a book. I'm trying to tell really good stories with a whole lot of the evidence and the facts and the figures you need, but I want to do it in a way that is fun and interesting to read or compelling to read, I guess. And I feel like one of the great things about my job is that I get to go spend time with scientists, and really when you write a book, you get to spend time in a much deeper way, and visit their labs and spend hours, or go to their field sites for days, and really get them to talk about they're not just doing a quick little interview with you with a few sound bites. You're really digging into the meat of the work and the passion that they have for it. And so a lot of them have become my friends now, which is really nice and a bonus, I guess. And I did find in this exactly what you're saying. I mean, I know that a lot of times the scientists write primarily about their own work and touch on other things, but this book is so interdisciplinary and has so many different kinds of scientists in it And I did find that some of them were really intrigued by what else I was doing, and I was introducing them to some of the other work in a different sort of, field that was related to what they were doing. I was surprised they didn't know, but they didn't always, because, people get a little bit siloed.
That's true. Yeah, they get into a narrow category, and then the broadness really expands that. You can only do so much in a narrow category before you start to feel like you've put yourself into a box, and then anybody that helps you extend outward, it's like refreshing. Thank you. Thanks for this air.
Yes, yes.
Now, one thing you just mentioned that's very key. I wasn't actually thinking about that, but I want to include that. One key point for me in 2020 is because of good old Kobe Bryant and his message of storytelling these last couple of years. You just talked about that, the power of story. You mentioned that in every chapter you start with a story and then you connect into the concept. It's nice because it relates to you went there, you saw these monkeys do this, you saw research about what people were doing in this capacity, and then you go to the details of it. Story is something that brings you in. There's a compelling power that you can't just do with facts, or everybody would just be in the library, maybe. They would just be reading books.
For sure. And the really important thing is that scientists and science needs to be out in the world and understood by people who are not scientists. And you have to make it accessible, and you have to. I also think that science is fundamentally a terrific story. I mean, it's got all kinds of intriguing plot twists and developments and people who are interesting, and it's got a beginning and a middle and not, of course, an end, because it's always evolving. But you take an idea and you look at how have we changed how we think about this idea, and what do we know about the world so far, and how did we figure it out. That's a story, and that's how I love to approach it and tell it in my books.
Now, as far as friendship, what led to the focus on friendship to write this book in the first place? Why did you analyze that?
Well, as a science journalist, I spend a lot of my time listening in on scientists when they speak to each other at meetings and conferences, and listening in for what they're interested in, what they think is important, what they think is new. And this question of the biology of friendship seemed really interesting to me, because it's such a serious way of looking at social behavior. And I did notice, I mean, there's all these kind of subfields. So now there's neuroscience and there's social neuroscience and there's epidemiology and then there's social epidemiology. And so this looking in the last few decades at social behavior has really increased dramatically. And I was fascinated by that. I mean, most of my work is I mostly cover the brain and psychology. So it was through social neuroscience that I got interested in this. And I loved that there was this question of not just mapping the connections inside the brain, but mapping the connections from your brain out into the world to the people that you're connected to, and showing why and how it mattered. And but then friendship in particular struck me as the piece of the relationship story that really hadn't been told, hadn't been focused on, and it's kind of a metaphor for the whole. I mean, scientists didn't take friendship all that seriously for a long time. I mean, of course, we knew it was pleasurable and valuable, but we didn't think it was invaluable. We thought, or essential. And now we know that it is, and that it has this really fundamental effect on your mental and your physical health, your longevity, and so I thought it would be really interesting to treat it as seriously as I think it deserves to be treated.
Mm-hmm. It is a very key concept. After the book, you start to feel like any sorts of socializing or friendship you have built in your time was a big health bonus that you put into your life. Now, early in the book, you talk about how many parts of the book, you talk about how monkeys were analyzed to see how they related to us and what we could learn from them, looking at scientists that actually went into their community. Can you speak a bit about scientists going into the communities of monkeys to test what their responses would be?
Sure. Now, I do want to say to begin that I said earlier that, people work in their silos. But one thing that's really interesting especially about social neuroscience, is that actually it's one field where animal work and human work coexist. And the meetings of social neuroscientists have both kinds of work. So that's how I understood from the start that the work that was being done in monkeys was going to be relevant and important. And it's the work that really has contributed the most to our evolutionary understanding of this idea that there is this actual survival of the friendliest. It's not all survival of the fittest. And so the thing that has led to us, so part of the work that people do in monkeys, it's in mostly in rhesus macaques and baboons, but all kinds of other species as well, is look at things like they isolate social behavior and look at the brain and try to figure out where the commonalities are, where the boundaries are between animals and humans, and they keep moving. Animals are able to do far more than we usually think. Every time we say they can't do it, we discover that they can. We have to, shift the goalpost. But the really interesting work on the evolutionary front are these long-running field sites where researchers follow the animals and observe them very carefully in this kind of rigorous way. But essentially what they're doing is they're working like gossip columnists. They're exacting gossip columnists who are tracking who does what to whom and what happens as a result. and who was nearby. And so from that and from doing that for decades, they generated all kinds of research and data that when they analyzed it, they were able to discover just how critical the strength of social bonds were. And it was actually more important than dominance hierarchies, which are a major feature of monkey life. And I mean, they also exist in human lives, but we don't, not as explicitly maybe. And so it was the big surprise was that that social bonds mattered so very much in the baboons, in the macaques. It affects your reproductive success, how many babies you have and how long they live, and it affects your own longevity as an individual if you're a monkey, a baboon. And basically you can't do better than that in evolutionary terms, right? Mm-hmm. Reproductive success and longevity is what it's all about.
This is true. I noticed a lot about the dominance hierarchies, and throughout the book I was comparing their actions to what people do. And you're right, yes. It's not as explicit in people, but definitely it's almost on par.
It's there. It's there. The similarities are many between mm-hmm. our societies and these monkey societies.
It's almost like looking at them, you can see a good percentage of what people are thinking underneath their actions, but not saying publicly. It's almost like that to me.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Now, after some of those studies, you also mentioned how kids start growing up and recognize social skills, how they develop to make friends. Can you speak a bit about the early friendship stages that kids go through and what they represent, why they had to be there evolutionarily?
Yes. We humans come into the world with a sort of predisposition for social behavior, but your lived experience really determines how that develops, right? And so it was fascinating to me that neuroscientists can see the difference in the brain of a baby born yesterday versus a baby born today. They can see more specialization to social activity, social behavior in the brain. And that first 2 years of life is this critical period where babies are learning to process the world, the signals they see, so they respond differently, for instance, to a hand waving than to a truck moving. And even though there's motion in both things, the hand is a social signal, right? And the truck is not. And they're more different parts of the brain are, they're more attuned to the social stuff. They use different parts of the brain to look at it. And in the first 2 years of life, there's this specialization that just increases literally day by day to be social. So that's the first part. And parents and caregivers are kind of priming all of that. And I don't know if we think enough about how much as a parent of a very young child, you're not just sort of feeding and sheltering and protecting your kid. You are laying the groundwork for whether they will be a good friend and whether they will have the ability to make and maintain friends. And then as kids get to school age, they need evolutionarily they need those peer relationships, and it's across cultures around the world and in other species. Like there's something different that goes on in adolescence, and it's a really social time, and that's by design. And there's different skills that kids are getting. They're getting trust and cooperation and loyalty and how to work in a group of peers and understand group dynamics and things like that. And humans, have this much longer period between weaning and puberty, and a lot of it is devoted to developing the social brain and the big brain. And then as we move on in life, I mean, by the time we're adults, our brains are in fact always changing. We know this now, but most of those networks are laid down. Um, and then has more to do with what it looks like in our lives at that point. But the really interesting thing is, all through life, I mean, you always have the ability to make new friends and to change how you're doing it. But it's those early years where you're most fundamentally involved. Oh, and I forgot to mention a critical moment is the development of empathy and theory of mind, and the ability to predict what someone else is thinking or what they might believe, and to understand that it's different from what you know. And that's a foundational thing that develops in kids over time. But a sort of critical moment is like age 3 or 4, and after that, they look like they have more friendships that are really friendships, not just parallel play, right?
Right. I like that you mentioned in the book some of the friendships early on in life. It's like, they don't hit me. That's a
Right.
friend.
No, I actually thought that was profound. So when they asked preschoolers, how do you define a friend? What's a good friend? They said, a friend shares with me, plays with me, and doesn't hit me. And I was like, man, truer words have never been spoken. It's true for us, right? Your
Hmm.
friends are the people who help you, who make you feel good, and who don't hurt you. And it looks a little different in adulthood, but the fundamental truths are still there.
I can confirm this. My friends are not hitting me, which is nice.
Good. I am glad.
It's a
I'm glad.
gift.
Yes.
One thing I noticed the kids, you talked about that faces matter more than any other visual stimulus, and then made me think of Facebook. It's not called like leg book or knee book or something.
Uh-huh.
That's where all the detail is at, and
Yeah.
that was probably a key point that he thought about when he formed that network. That I mean, it's obvious, I guess, to some, but that's where all the differentiation is that we have built in over time.
Yeah, that's true. I know though that Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, partly I'm not sure if he came, I mean, he obviously named his
Hmm.
business that, but those exist on college campuses, right? I mean, when I was in college before Mark Zuckerberg, we got, and I think they called it a Facebook, where they had a little headshot of every other student in your new incoming year, and everybody pored over them sort of
Like,
religiously, right? Yeah, like, who's this person? Who is he? Because you're thinking all these people have the potential to be new friends. When you get to college, I mean, it's so intensely social, right? And so what he did was take all that, right, and put it online and create this juggernaut.
one thing slightly related to this, it's not exactly in the book, but sort of. But do you ever have a feeling that you can tell just from people's face, like their personality in some form?
I'm not sure you can tell their personality, or I can't say if well, okay. People who are really super negative about the world, I think you can see that
Mm.
because they just always
Just
look,
like,
yeah, they look whatever,
right.
suspicious or something like that. You can see all kinds of emotion in the face, which is why the face is such an important signal for social behavior, right?
Mhm.
And the eyes in particular, and so um, personality, I don't know.
It
Maybe,
might be a stretch.
maybe.
Sometimes I feel it. Now, one thing in another section you talked about stress. I always focus on people's stress, how they're impacted by others. That's why I like the monkey studies. You can see like the dominance hierarchy. When one like subjugates the other one, then this one feels a stress response. This one feels like a slight victory. It is sort of like a win-lose at that moment. And
Yes.
and then you talked about how the most common source of stress in people is interpersonal relations with other humans. Can we speak a bit about on stress?
Stress is really important, and it is one of the ideas that really kind of undergirds this research. It was one of the concepts that recognizing. So some of the earliest work understanding stress and the way that it created a physiological response in the body was it predates understanding the importance of social relationships, but it fed into it all, right? And so your stress responses are increased by all the stresses of day-to-day life. And really what friendship on an evolutionary level is about is helping us develop a way to get through and to sort of weather the stresses of day-to-day life so that you've got other individuals there to help protect you. And what they find is things like, let's say there was a kind of famous study where they had two friends standing and looking at a hillside. They were outside, and I think, or maybe it was just a picture of it, but they're looking at, and they think they have to go climb it and walk up it. And if you're with a friend, you see that as much less difficult to do, and your stress level is lower. And friends can get in and buffer stress when you have to do public speaking or things like that. Public speaking always comes up in these studies as a way of testing stress. Math problems and public speaking are the two things that are used. There's a set of studies that test stress, and that's what they use, which really makes me laugh. But it shows how universal the stress level is for those things.
That's kind of funny. One thing, I tutor math also, so that's one of my categories
go.
I like to do. And if I'm not doing public speaking within 5 years, no. So maybe I kind of like that. Do you find yourself, by the way, unrelated, but do you like things like public speaking or group scenario where you're discussing to a lot of people?
Yeah, I am probably unusual in that I'm not as intimidated about that, and I kind of like being the center of attention. I suppose there's something
Everybody,
to
Lydia.
that. Yeah, here I am.
Cool.
But I enjoy getting a positive response from people, and that's always been true. But even that said, I mean, and also my job kind of requires me to then go talk about what I do, and do interviews like this, and go on television, and stand up and talk to people in bookstores and at meetings and conferences, but I always get nervous right before a big public speaking event. So the stress is still there. It's just that I guess I'm better able to see the potential positives and to sort of use the stress, because some stress is good for us, right? It gets us like amped up to take an exam, or to get ready to do a public talk or whatever it is. But it's when stress is unrelieved and sort of chronic that it causes these health problems.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the opposite end of those who have many friendships is those that have very few. Talked about in this book a fair amount, loneliness, people who are separate from the crowd, the outliers on a big network scale. What are some of the life impacts on people who are in that category, and how heritable are some of the traits connected to loneliness?
So sociability traits are heritable, but not, and I'm forgetting the exact percentage, but I'm going to say it's under 25%. But the thing about loneliness is that what we've now understand is just how bad it is for your health. I do want to clarify that doesn't mean, because a lot of people ask, well, but I'm an introvert, or, I like being alone. And that's okay. First of all, being an introvert doesn't mean you don't have friends. It just means maybe that you do your socializing in a different way. Maybe you prefer just to spend time with one friend alone and not with a larger group. That's totally fine. What really matters is that you do have those one-on-one relationships. And then there are people who really enjoy being alone. Loneliness, in a sort of from a social neuroscience point of view, is actually the mismatch between what you want in terms of social connection and what you have. And so if there's no mismatch, you're not that lonely, right? But And then the corollary to that is that we can think about loneliness as actually the body's signal that you need to connect with people, just like thirst and hunger tell you that you need to eat and drink. And that was a really radical change in the thinking. And what they find, you asked about the effects of it. So, I mean, loneliness is almost no part of your physiology and your biology that isn't affected by loneliness. It affects your cardiovascular functioning, your immune functioning, your sleep quality, your cognitive health, just your mental health, tendency to depression and things like that. And a lot of people thought, well, no, maybe the depression comes first and the loneliness comes along for the ride. But the researchers really looked at that very carefully and found no, the loneliness causes depression. And so it's just so important, and it affects how long you live, actually. So people who are really lonely, a social isolation, as a lot of people probably have heard this statistic, but it's as bad for us as smoking and obesity in terms of our longevity, mortality.
Mm-hmm. I like that you describe it that way. The mismatch between, let's say you desire here by default and it's here and you're lonely. If you desire here by default and it's here, you're fine.
Yeah.
Just matching your internal desire.
Yeah.
Mine's kind of high, but then I try to keep it high, so it's generally good. But for some people, just one person talking to them might be enough for a whole
might
week.
be enough. I suspect, however, I just will say, I suspect there's some people who claim that they're not lonely and actually are, maybe more. They just don't want to admit to it, or they, have convinced themselves that they, and it's often true that, there's a lot of times, for instance, where you think, I just want to stay home tonight and watch Netflix and eat ice cream. And, I don't want to make the effort to go out. And a lot of people, usually, if you do make the effort and go out and hang out with your friends, you're glad you did. Very few people report back to me that they are sorry they went,
Right.
And so I think sometimes we just have to push ourselves that little bit extra and not sort of rely on the thing. Well, I'm introverted and I like to stay home. And I say that as someone who actually does enjoy spending plenty of time by myself. So I am not afraid to go to a restaurant by myself, a movie by myself. I love like a night when none of my family needs me and I can just like watch what I want to watch on TV and eat what I'm all about that. But you really do need to put in that make that effort. And yes, even if it's just the one person you need, then make sure you do spend time with that person.
I like that, by the way. To me, I'm very tuned in on self-esteem and fear. And when I hear that, I think of good self-esteem, because some people might want to go to that same restaurant by themselves, but they would never do it because of what will I be thought of? And then the other people in the restaurant are just eating their sandwich. They're not.
They don't care that much about you.
Like, imagine if they had their life so in order that now they're paying attention to other people, caring wise, and they're think about that person. I'm judging them, but I care about them. Really, what's the chance that they're actually? No, there's almost no world where that thought would come into play. But in a way, that's ego on those individuals' end more so than yours, because they're thinking people can focus on me. And then other people, if they go to some celebrity-oriented thing, they want to get attention. You can't even get attention in 2020, and then that person's thinking they're all gonna. It's inverted.
It's true. It's true.
It's a funny thing. In one of your chapters, you talk about a very important part in people's life, which is middle school and lunchtime there, which one thing I note from that chapter and focusing on that, all these key moments in life, most of the people along the way think it's like just them at that time, and then later on they realize it was them and 48,000 other people at the time. What items can we look at as far as the dynamic at lunchtime for middle school kids and what that says about their future?
Right. So I'll just say that, that insight came from another mother when my oldest child was about to start middle school, and we were sort of chatting in the summer before school started, and her kids were older, so she'd been through it. And she said to me, middle school is about lunch. And I recognized at the moment that this was a profound statement, and that and she had just handed me this wonderful piece of parental wisdom, because so much of what we care about as parents about school is about the academics and things. And we know the social scene it matters. And especially in middle school, I mean, it's such a sort of turbulent time for anybody. Your hormones are starting to run wild. You're figuring out your identity and all that. But the idea that lunch was so critical. And then I realized, of course, because think about all the movies and books that have those terrible scenes in the cafeteria, right? And standing there with your tray and no one to eat with is this just, oh God, it's hard even to think, makes you feel pain in your, remembering those kinds of moments. And so it's because it's all about establishing this, where you are in the social hierarchy. There we go. There's a hierarchy, right? There's the cool kids at this table, or there's this clique, and there's that group, and then the kids who are totally alone are, now maybe some of them want to be that way, but a lot of them, don't, and so I think the takeaway for parents and teachers is sorry, my dog is starting to bark back here.
Oof.
I hope you're not hearing
That's fine.
that.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's life right there.
Yeah. The takeaway for parents and teachers is just to understand how much friendships are inside kids. Like that's what they're focused on. And they tend to do better actually if they get to be with their friends, and if you sort of, a lot of times, teachers say, oh, well, these kids are being disruptive or they're spending too much time talking to their friends, which is true. They do that. And kids need to meet us halfway, right? Maybe if teachers and parents are trying to stop, are trying to separate kids from their friends, then they need to sorry, the dog's barking is
That's part of life.
I'm losing my train of thought. That we need to factor in how important friendship is for kids' success, and then kids, maybe if we could get into the mind of an 11-year-old or 12-year-old in middle school and say, look, we will give you a shot at being with your friends, but you have to meet us halfway by behaving and not distracting the class, or not, and some kids are able to do that and others are not. But it's just really that sense of how much the social brain is hyper stimulated by social activity at that point in life, and adults just have to recognize it. And too often we're sort of like, oh, please, kids, it's not all about your friends, but it actually is.
I noticed that two things that came to mind about that section was it's the emotional part you remember of. You don't remember like third period, but you'll remember that part of the day.
You're right.
Because emotions are remembered years later. And
Yes.
then the other part is it makes me think of that kids don't realize that not only is everybody else having the same thoughts as them, like where do they fit in, but let's say those few that already had like 5 brothers and sisters, or they were part of a popular crew. That was from before. In life, it's always almost fair. Like other than that, but that was separate. That had nothing to do with you. If you come in knowing that beforehand, it's like you outdid the moment, and then you'll always be confident in whatever you do forever. So.
Yeah, I always think if you scratch the surface of anybody's life, you find that there's always stuff, right? And some of it is just that we all have to navigate life in the same challenges, and we all have the same insecurities and things like that. It's also true that most people, there may well be more going on in their life behind the scenes than any of us know. So I do feel like you should sort of meet people with as few assumptions and as possible. And in middle school, that's a good way to be, right? And in high school. But yes, middle school is hard for everyone. That it seems to be very clear. The other thing about it that's really interesting from a friendship point of view is that, so in the US, of course, most kids start middle school in 6th grade, and they come from other schools. And so they tend to start with a few close friends, and then I think it's 3/4 of them change friends by the end of the school year. And it's because it's this time when you're finding your identity, and you are, figuring out who you want to be in the world. And that change is actually normal, I guess, is one of the things that's important to understand. And so if one friend of your old friend from elementary school now is developing another interest, instead of agonizing about that, if we can encourage kids to go find other children who have the same interests as you, that's where you're going to find your real friends, your people.
That's true. I always speak about my people Actually, I have that in the trailer for my channel. I talk about connecting with some people who are my people who have
Yeah,
insights or thoughts, or you want whatever that is. If I liked, I don't know, playing baseball and just talking about baseball, they'll be my people, and I'd find individuals or
it is.
certain
And
stuff.
yeah, and another interesting thing I think about kids and the social scene for kids in schools is that, of course, there's this, there's the popular kids and less popular kids, and we often kind of, people think of athletes as successful and popular, and maybe the computer kids are less popular or they're nerdier or something. But actually, and that of course there's some of that going on, but it's also true that the computer kids are likely to be friends because they're together in the computer lab for hours and hours and hours, and the football kids are likely to be friends because they're out on the field and at practice for hours and hours. And so it's not always so easy to develop a strong friendship. Now, it's important to be kind to everybody and to treat people well, and not to, bullying is terrible for kids, and so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about expecting them to develop strong friendships across those groups is is not always a fair expectation. Adults don't really do it either. It's great though. Kids who do a lot of different things do tend to have more diverse friendships and be more resilient and better at making friends with new and different kinds of people. So, meaning that, like, if you go to a school that's a very diverse environment, that's one thing. Or even if you go to a school that's more homogenous in terms of like all white kids or all black kids, but you do like orchestra and sports and academic or whatever it is, you are more likely to have friends from each of those different things that you do, and that does tend to develop into having sort of more tolerance and resilience, which is interesting. So it's good to create those kinds of environments and encourage kids in those environments to reach across to other areas.
It's
Yes.
one of the best things. I think to me the my favorite people are the ones that can do a little bit of like jumping from. I don't know if you've ever seen like a map where it's like a bunch of hills and it's like a 3D space and you can stay on your hill and it's comfortable. You can go up to the top of your hill, but that hill over there might be higher, but you have to do a jump before you can get there. Takes a risk,
Mm-hmm.
but then that hill might be up to here. It's a
Mm-hmm.
nice feature. One thing I noted throughout the book, this was a great thing, is that you illuminated the work of many women scientists that are doing great things. And then you focused on also research that included female mice, which were left out of studies. Only the male mice were done in studies, and the concept of their potential to tend and befriend versus
Tend
what
and
the male.
befriend. Right, right. It turned out to be really important in the work in other animals, especially, that scientists started looking at female animals and not at the males. And this was true in the work on stress. It was true in the evolutionary stuff, and it was almost entirely female scientists who had that kind of epiphany and changed what they focused on. And so, yeah, I loved that. I mean, it's such a sort of great piece of the story, is like saying, wait a minute. I mean, when you're talking about baboons, for instance, all the attention early on was on the males, that's where the action is, that's sex and fighting and all that stuff. And it was only when the attention shifted to saying, I think what's going on with those females is actually pretty important and has real repercussions and or consequences for the next generation. And it's quieter, but it did turn out that intuition turned out to be exactly right. The other thing that's really interesting is that finding that, like, the strength of social bonds among female baboons being so important caused a lot of researchers then to go back and look at the males again and to look at them more carefully and discovered, oh, you know what? It wasn't so obvious, but they all have these tight bonds too, and it matters for them too. So it's like, the more you know, the more you see, right? And you got to be looking something like friendship. And so, yeah, the female scientists were looking at a different way, and then they studied different things, and then they changed the entire field.
Hmm. It's almost like you just look at the visible light and then add in the ultraviolet light, and you're like, oh, that was there the whole time. It was just.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right. That's
It was.
exactly right. And I do want to just say, so I got a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to write this book, and part of, they like to support female science writers, and they also are looking a lot for work about female scientists. So I got I hit on 2 points there. Even though this wasn't only about female scientists, there are so many of them that is kind of a feature, and I'm glad you noticed.
Yeah. One of the one of the first ones that always comes to mind. I once did a text interview with her, Lisa Randall from Harvard.
Yeah.
She wrote Dark Matter and the Dinosaurs. I liked how she made that. I don't usually read about the universe, but I found that to be interesting. So that was kind of cool. One quote I liked, or message I liked a lot in the book that I bolded it in my notes, was talking about how strong social bonds mattered more than rank for baboons. Yes. Can you speak on that? And does that relate with people? Like if you have a good friend versus how high their rank is, you guys have a chance to build something great together, more likely.
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit before when we were talking about the fact that dominance hierarchies are such an integral part of monkey life, and of course, less explicitly, but just as true about human life. It is true that the best friendships for humans do tend to have a little bit more equality in them, and that it just makes it easier to really have the reciprocity and cooperation that's necessary, and then ultimately in people the kind of honesty and ease of companionship, because if you're with your boss all the time, you might not be as relaxed as or if you are and you have that, then that's great. It's not that it's impossible, it's just that it's less likely. So yeah, when there's a hierarchy, it's another reason why parents and kids have a vertical relationship with some authority and things like that. We hope there's authority, and that's where this idea that you should or shouldn't be friends with your kids is it is harder to really truly be friends with your kids, which doesn't mean that you have great love and affection for them, that you don't have great love and affection. You do, but in fact, you aren't really trying to be their friend, because you're trying to teach them things and guide them, and also you have to deliver hard news a lot of the time, and discipline them and not be afraid of that, and yet you want to keep the lines of communication open. And I think that's an important part. Take friendship and apply it to your parenting. Like I said, being more aware of how much friendship matters to them. And I hope people have really positive relationships with their kids, but that the real friendships, and that's like maybe one exception to my sort of statement that our biological relationships can be great friendships too, but it's better when there's more equality.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Then you have more room to connect with, versus the other one might make you a little bit more nervous. Oh, should I say that? Can I say that? And then you can't be as
there's functional. Some of that. I mean, I say this as someone who's awfully close to my 3 kids, and I do feel like they share a lot with me, but I don't. It's a different dynamic than the relationship that they have with their friends. And that's as it should be. So yeah. I think it comes up more in terms of work friendships, right? I mean, I mentioned that earlier, but with your boss, I said, that's where that question really comes into play.
Right, the dynamic. Now, one thing about friendships is most of us have just a few really close friends. I like how you broke down the hours almost it takes to make a friend, from an acquaintance to a casual friend to a close friend to a best friend. And what is an ideal number of friendships for a person to have? How much familial friendship does there need to be? And does there need to be any familial friendship in play?
You need to have at least one friend. So the real step change is between 0 and 1 for your health. Okay. But most people have their closest circle, their inner circle is usually about 4 people is the average. And it's often maybe half family members and half friends. But what I think is most critical is it's less. So quality matters more than quantity, and quality matters more than the origin of the bond. So it's great if those are family members and you have that kind of relationship with them. But sometimes we don't either. I mean, it can be really toxic and negative, or it can just be that you love each other, but you're not great friends. You don't, rely on each other in that way. And so I wouldn't necessarily put those people in thinking about your inner circle. Those people there that, let's call it 4, the average, they should be the ones that really those are positive relationships that, you can rely on. They're stable. They've been around a long time, and that there's helpfulness, there's cooperation and reciprocity, and you kind of meet each other halfway, and it's not tit for tat. Like, I just want to emphasize that one of the lovely things about deep human friendship is that the accounting of, well, I did this for you, now you have to do that for me, it goes away, right? When you get really close to someone. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, like over the years, there needs to be back and forth, right? So maybe one person has a crisis for a while, and there's more on there, and then eventually it'll come back. If it never comes back, then those relationships tend to wither away a bit. If there's never that back and forth over time.
Mm-hmm. I like that you mentioned that. Actually, I quoted that part about the indistinguishable give and take that shows up at some point. Yesterday, I quoted that.
Oh, good. I love that.
I like posting little quotes or the messages that are key. One last point I want to bring up from the book, because I don't want to give it all away to the people.
I know. We want people to buy the book and read it.
I like to go into detail because I take notes on all books in Evernote. I don't know. Do you use any note-taking software, by the way?
I try, but I'm still kind of an old-fashioned, like, write it down person. That's where it works best for me. I do take notes. I take notes on my phone sometimes, and sometimes in Evernote, and
That's a good segue, because writing down is the in-life version of the typing on the screen. Face-to-face interaction, you mentioned, is quite important versus the screen. I've talked about bandwidth before on the show, like the highest bandwidth is in person versus video versus audio than text, and the lowest bandwidth is a 1-bit like. Cal Newport, he once said that in his book. He's like, a 1-bit like, it says nothing, it's just like, I can't tell you anything.
Yeah.
Can you speak a bit about the importance of face-to-face interaction as far as friendship?
Certainly. It is essential for those closest bonds. You can't, I think I said before that, if you communicate with your friend in multiple ways, and including online, it strengthens the friendship. But there has to be some face-to-face time, and eye contact and face-to-face time. Actually, eye contact triggers the social and language parts of our brain, the communication parts of our brain, and it sort of primes us to interact socially. And looking at someone on a screen has less of an effect, and if there's no visual, it's very different. And so there is something very special about that time together, and all those hours cannot be spent that you need. They cannot be spent online yet. And so it's 50 hours to go from an acquaintance to a friend, and roughly 200 to develop a best friend. And that's a lot of hours, and they need, a good number of them need to be spent in person.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. It's not a light-natured thing. That's why we value them as people. And when other people have friendships, it's like a thing, because that's not a small investment. That's true.
Right.
One question I always like to ask: if you had one message to all the people on the planet that represents what you would want them to take away from what you do and or this book, what would that be in a sentence or two? As far as friendship, or what to take away.
I think I said this at the beginning. I think you asked me this at the beginning, but if I'm wrong, the big takeaway from this book is to give yourself permission to hang out with your friends. I am not trying to add to people's to-do list. I just want them to understand how important it is to be with your friends, and that you're doing something really good for yourself. And it's not just frivolous. It's not unimportant. And if it takes you away from work sometimes or from your family, that's okay. Or even spending the time with your family, if that's who your friends are. But like that, it's worth doing. People and friends are an excellent investment of your time, and the other stuff will still be there when you are done with your friends. You can go back to work, and maybe you'll be refreshed, and your biology will thank you. Your health will benefit.
The health benefits abound in this book. I'll once again showcase this for those who are seeing this on the screen. Friendship, a wonderful book worth reading and or taking notes on, and making science journalism cool again. Lydia Denworth, glad to have you on episode 247 of the show.
Thank you.
You know it. And we are out.